If you were to ask any Fortnite player what their favorite map is, there's a good chance they'll say either Chapter 1 or Chapter 2. Although there are now 5 maps to choose from, the vast majority favor the first two, and some even the third. But why not Chapter 5's map, and especially not Chapter 4's? Chapter 5 has only been out for about a month and a half, so it's hard to judge the map entirely before it has a chance to progress. However, the Chapter 5 map shares some on-launch flaws with Chapter 4. This video will highlight flaws from each of the more recent maps, but more specifically Chapter 4, and how these issues were not prevalent in previous Fortnite maps. When Chapter 4 launched, it introduced a mere 9 POIs, the least out of any new chapter launch. Chapter 5 was better with 11 POIs on launch, however these numbers are not on par with Chapter 3's 12, with the exception of Tilted being buried in the snow for the first half of the season, and Chapter 2's 13 POIs on launch, each of the maps being pretty comparable in size, if not Chapter 4 and 5 being larger. Of the 9 POIs introduced in Chapter 4, 3 of them, Breakwater Bay, Anvil Square, and Shattered Slabs, each reused the same medieval house assets. This rendered the POIs very similar and unoriginal. It made the map feel dull and less interesting. Not to mention these assets were scattered in pockets around the map, making the map feel even more repetitive. This same issue is prevalent in Chapter 5, with Snooty Steps, Hazy Hillside, and Pleasant Piazza, all using similar assets and having similar vibes. This phenomenon was pretty much unheard of back in Chapter 1 and 2. Every POI utilized assets unique to it. You may argue the suburban areas reused houses, however they all felt different and unique. Retail Row was merged with the shopping center, Pleasant had a soccer field and gazebo, and Salty was only a few houses, but had its own vibe. Not to mention Holly Hedges with the garden center, and the hedges encompassing the POI. In Chapter 2, for example, POIs were super fun and interesting, like Slurpee with the shield swamp and slurp barrels, as well as Steamy Stacks with the smokestacks you could fly through to use to rotate. You also had the volcano in Chapter 1 that you could fly through, Season 4 with the low gravity consumables at Dusty Divot, and Bouncy Loot Lake after Kevin dissolved into it. These are only a few examples of the thought and care that went into designing these POIs and how that translates to a fun gameplay experience. We do not see the same thought and care put into Chapter 4 and 5's POIs. For the majority, most POIs feel as though they were filler. Also, in Chapter 1 and 2, it always felt as though there was a POI for everyone. You had your goofy POIs like Slurpee or Greasy, and Tilted and Salty for sweaty players, as well as Pleasant and Retail for casual players. There is no distinction of POIs in Chapter 4 or 5. This is primarily due to a lack of character. Another thing not seen as much is side narratives and Easter eggs. In both Chapter 1 and 2, the Gnome and Teddy Bear storylines can be followed in-game by map changes. You also had the Rock family in Chapter 1 and Pipe Man in Chapter 2, each progressing throughout the respective chapters. Not to mention the infamous lore behind Hut Watch. The number of Easter eggs present in these first chapters is innumerable, from those side narratives to out-of-game references, like John Wick's house and Ferris Bueller's car. There are too many examples to mention. It added a layer of depth to the game, proving it was more than just a battle royale game, but instead an experience. These are things just not seen as frequently, if at all, in Chapter 4 and 5. The art style of the map has arguably taken a hit as well. Many players enjoyed the cartoonish, more simplistic feel of Chapter 1 and 2, which Chapter 4 and 5 take away and instead attempt to make the game more realistic. Fortnite is not meant to be as realistic and advanced as a game like Call of Duty. Chapter 1 and 2 had magical sunsets and atmospheres, something that is not reflected in Chapter 4 or 5. Not to mention the vibrant grass and trees that made the map feel lively in Chapter 1 and 2. With all these differences in the map quality of prior and recent chapters, it is important to acknowledge a possible correlation between map quality and yearly chapters. Chapter 4 and 5 are both yearly chapters, Chapter 4's map being completely rushed after ending Chapter 3 early. You may even be able to argue Chapter 3, the first year-long chapter, may have marked the start of this downfall. However, we haven't had enough yearly chapters to make a conclusive statement about this matter. It is possible that Fortnite maps may benefit from a longer time being worked on.